My name is Daniel Fass. I'm the head of the Department of Sociology here at Trinity College Dublin. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all to what is now the 9th event already in the TCD-UCD Sociology Public Lecture Series. I would like to welcome and thank my co-organizers, Professor Richard Late at Trinity, Dr. Ronald Moore at UCD, and I would also like to thank Darren Byrne for the sign language interpretation here tonight. As always, the event tonight is being filmed for the departmental website, but you can also see the recordings of all the keynotes that have taken place since we launched this keynote lecture series in 2012 on the college's YouTube playlist under TCD-UCD Sociology Public Lecture. A few housekeeping rules next. Firstly, could you all please ensure that your mobile phones are in silent mode or switched off? Secondly, please also locate the emergency exits, which is basically at the end of the room where you just came in. Tonight's keynote speakers are Professor Richard Wilkinson and Professor Kate Pickett, who will talk about why income inequality damages us all, the causal processes. Thank you so much for being here with us tonight. It's been a very busy day for our distinguished guests. This morning, both received the Charles Colley Medal from the Irish Cancer Society, which recognizes and awards leadership in the field of cancer control, cancer prevention or health policy, and provides an opportunity to highlight best practice or innovation in those areas. Immediately after this keynote tonight, they will both appear on Tonight with Vincent Brown, that airs from 11 p.m. tonight, if you'd like to watch that as well. Richard Wilkinson studied economic history at the LSE before training in epidemiology. His research drew attention to widening health inequalities and led him to ask the UK Secretary of State for Social Services to set up an urgent government inquiry. The result was the Black Report in 1980, which stimulated research on health inequalities internationally. Since then, Richard has played a formative role in international research on the social determinants of health and on the societal effects of income inequality. His books and papers have drawn attention to the tendency for societies with bigger income differences between rich and poor to have a higher prevalence of a wide range of health and social problems. Richard is now Professor Emeritus of Social Epidemiology at the University of Nottingham Medical School, Honorary Professor at University College London, and Visiting Professor at the University of York. He wrote The Spirit Level together with Kate Pickett, an international bestseller now available in 24 languages, which won the 2011 Political Studies Association Publication of the Year Award. He co-founded the Equality Trust, which works to improve the quality of life in the UK by reducing economic inequality. Kate Pickett is Professor of Epidemiology in the Department of Health Sciences at the University of York. Kate was a UK National Institute for Health Research Career Scientist from 2007 to 12. She's a Fellow of the UK Faculty of Public Health and has published widely in both the academic and policy domains on the distribution of health and illness in the population and the social and economic risk factors that contribute to this. One thread of Kate's recent research has focused on the social determinants of health, including the role of social class, income inequality, neighbourhood context and ethnic density on such varied outcomes as mortality and morbidity, teenage birth, obesity, sudden infant death syndrome and health-related behaviours. A second line of research focuses on smoking in pregnancy, its causal role in relation to behavioural problems in children, and its psychosocial context. Perhaps most famously, Kate co-authored The Spirit Level that I've just mentioned with Richard Wilkinson, which has been one of the few books actually in the social sciences to cross over into the mainstream domain. Kate is also the co-founder and director of the Equality Trust I mentioned. Professors Wilkinson and Pickett will speak for about 50 minutes or so, and that is followed by a 30-minute question and answer session where I would ask you all that would like to ask our two speakers a question to come forward. We have a roaming mic at that stage, and then take your questions, 2 or 3, and then I'll ask them to answer them in turn. So all of you will get a chance to engage with our speakers, and we hope to wrap it up by about 8:30 p.m. So please give a very warm welcome to our distinguished guests for tonight, Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett.
Well, thank you very much for that over-generous introduction, and thank you all for coming this evening. I hope you won't stay out till 11 to see us again. I think you'll have more than enough after this. I need to start with an apology. This slide. Kate and I have done many hundreds of talks, and we're constantly changing titles and names, whether Kate does it by herself or me by myself or the two of us together. So this should say Kate Pickett as well as me. But we are.
I thought you were about the title being wrong.
The title's wrong as well. Small details, you know. We have given talks in 5 different countries in the last 9 days, I think, so that's worse than usual. I'd like to start off with this picture, simply because it shows how miserable we all are. Those are people in the prime of life, like most of you, with a few exceptions, I see. These outside Oxford Street Tube Station, going to work in the morning, not the unemployed or the poor, but every face there looks depressed or anxious or cross or just surly. And I think that, you know, it reminds me that I think one of the things we are talking about perhaps is the contrast between the unparalleled material prosperity and comfort of modern societies and their many social failings. And indeed, I think we, as we get into thinking about how to respond to climate change, we have to think more about how to produce well-being more efficiently than our societies do at the moment. Our message, as you probably all know, is just this. I feel that we could now stop and start a discussion, but that's what we're going to be showing you over and over again. We feel, I think, that because income inequality is taken as it's politically a very sensitive issue, a hot potato, if you like, that our work has been treated as if it was simply a political argument. So tonight we're going to stress what we see as the scientific basis of it, and talk more about the arguments that it's a causal relationship we're showing you, and talk more about what mediates between income distribution and the many harmful effects that we're going to show you. So, where we really start the work, though, is here. I want really to show you that we're dealing with relative income in our societies. This is the curve of life expectancy internationally against national income per person. And you see the rapid rises in life expectancy in the early stages of economic development, and then it levels out. That curve is important because if you look at happiness in relation to national income per head or other measures of well-being, you see very much the same curve. The rapid rises early on and then levelling out. That's not because we've got to the limits of human life expectancy. It's not a sort of ceiling effect. Life expectancy in most of our societies is still increasing as fast as it has done over the last 100 or more years. Every decade that passes, we get another 2 or 3 years life expectancy. That's going on. But it's unrelated now to economic growth. So if you're stuck, say, on $30,000 per capita, that curve moves up over time, and so it buys more life expectancy as time goes on. We get higher life expectancy not by moving out along that curve, but by the curve moving up. And even if you look at changes over time, even periods as long as 20 or 40 years, you see virtually no relationship between the two. We're going to talk just about these countries, and this is basically the top right-hand part of that last curve blown up. So you can see very clearly that some countries, Norway, USA on the right, are twice as rich as Israel, Greece and Portugal on the left, and it makes no difference to life expectancy at all. And yet, you all know that within our societies there are these huge differences in life expectancy between rich and poor areas, between upper and lower classes, between rich and poor individuals. We were at the Cancer Society this morning, and they showed data that there are threefold differences in cancer rates between the rich and poor areas of Dublin. So some areas people are 3 times as likely to... Was it cancer incidence or death rates?
Yes.
Deaths from cancer. Most of that is differences in incidence rather than in fatality once you've got them. But look, this is a paradox. No effect of differences in national income there, and yet this extraordinary gradient in life expectancy across our societies. These are small neighbourhoods of England and Wales, sorry it's not Ireland, classified by deprivation, so on the right are the most deprived with the shortest life expectancy, on the left the least deprived, the richest with the highest life expectancy. It's not a difference just between the poor and the rest of us. The gradient goes right across society. You can take away all the problem of poverty and poor health, and you still have most of the problem of health inequalities left. We are all part of this picture. And indeed, to explain what's going on, you need to have an explanation of why the people just below the top do less well than the people at the top. We need a different kind of theory. It's no longer enough just to think about material standards and their direct effects. What we did was simply to download figures on all sorts of things, including income differences from various different websites. These figures on income differences come from the UN Human Development Report website. Basically, how much richer the top 20% in each country and the bottom 20%. And you see in the more equal countries on the left, Japan, Finland, Norway, Sweden, the top 20% is 3.5 or 4 times as rich as the bottom 20%. But in the more unequal countries on the right, UK, Portugal, USA, Singapore, the difference is twice as big. So although they're all rich market democracies, where people, go from one to the other for holidays or business or whatever it is, they differ very much in terms of levels of inequality. And you can see the middle of those 3 blue bars is Ireland, just to the right of the middle, when we got this data, your rich were about 6 times as rich, the top 20% as the bottom 20%. Inequalities have been widening in most places, including Ireland, so we've all got worse. Your relative position won't have changed as much as your inequality has changed. But it's because of those big differences in inequality that we're able to ask, what does inequality do to a society? And for centuries, people have regarded inequality as divisive and socially corrosive. But people haven't been able to look at the data. But now we can compare how big these income differences are. We can look at many different outcomes. One of the advantages of looking at these rich developed countries is that much more data is comparable between them than you can get if you look at poorer countries. What we did was collect data on a number of major international problems and differences in performance, like life expectancy, maths and literacy scores, infant mortality rates, homicide rates in different countries, the proportion of the population in prison, teenage birth rates, how much people feel they can trust others, obesity, mental illness, which in the standard psychiatric classification includes, perhaps rather surprisingly, drug and alcohol addiction, and some figures on social mobility. Those are all problems with social gradients. Although there's mental illness and ill health and so on at the top of society, and violence and drug abuse are all more common at the bottom. And it's those problems that seem to be worse in more unequal countries. I'm going to take you through that data, but we put them all into one index. They're all weighted equally, so where our country is its sort of average score for these things. And you see the more unequal countries doing worse. The higher they are, the worse they're doing. USA, Portugal, UK doing badly, and on the left, the more equal countries having lower levels of all these problems. But if you look at that in relation to national income per head, exactly the same figures for each society up the side, there's no relationship there. We were worried that people would, and because we were writing before anyone was concerned with inequality at all, we were worried that people would think we'd chosen these problems just to suit our argument. So we also looked at somebody else's index, the UNICEF Index of Child Wellbeing. It's made up to measure child wellbeing in rich societies. It's compiled of about 40 components. We have nothing to do with putting them together, so it's not our picking and choosing. I can't remember the additional points we can make about that. Anyway, here is that UNICEF Index of Child Wellbeing in relation to income inequality. The more unequal countries on the right doing worse, lower standards of child wellbeing. In that measure are whether kids can talk to their parents, what immunisation rates are like, what their maths and literacy scores are like, whether there's bullying at school. It all goes in. They've now released an update of that measure of well-being with some slightly different components. Kate went through the data, and there's a very similar relationship with income inequality. I think I haven't got it here. Oh yes, there it is. So that's the new UNICEF index. But again, if you look at that same index of child well-being in relation to gross national income per head, there's not a suggestion of a relationship. We talk about child poverty as a problem, and yet we must distinguish between relative and absolute poverty. I showed you that income was so important within our societies and didn't matter at all between our societies. And that paradox, which I think means within our societies, those light blue bars I showed you of life expectancy in small areas of England and Wales, that is an effect of relative income or social position, where you are in relation to others in society. And as soon as you've got that idea that it's about relativities, not about absolute levels of living, you must think, what happens if we make the differences between us bigger or smaller? And that's now what we're showing you. This is, I'm going to show you just a few. I wish we had more time, but we haven't, so I'm going to show you just some of the components of our index in relation to income inequality, so you get an idea of the scatter, how close or loosely the fit is. This is a measure of trust, used very widely as a measure of social cohesion, comes from the World Values Survey. It's the percentage of the population agreeing that most people can be trusted. And you see on the right, the more unequal societies, it falls to 15 or 20% of the population feel they can trust others. But on the left, the more equal countries, it rises to 60 or 65%. There are now a number of papers showing that same relationship. I've just forgotten I cut out the data we had on the American states, where you see just the same scatter, the more equal states having much higher levels of trust than the less equal American states. We use the American states as sort of separate test bed for these relationships. But it's not only how much people trust each other, it's also violence. In more unequal societies, these dots are American states, the blue triangles are Canadian provinces. This is a more dramatic relationship than we showed in our book, but partly because we didn't look at the Canadian provinces. Daly and Wilson did substantial work throughout their careers on the determinants of violence. And this shows, amongst those more equal provinces at the bottom, sort of 15 homicides per million, and it rises to 150. There's a tenfold difference in homicide rates, closely related to inequality. People often greet our work as if this was a recent invention of ours, but actually for the first papers on income inequality and population health, or income inequality and violence, were published in the 1970s, late 1970s. There are now 200 papers looking at these issues. And one of the reasons why we don't go into more sophisticated analyses is because other people had, and we were trying to present a very simple picture to show what had been, the picture that had been building up in the academic journals, and make it as accessible to people as possible. And so if you start controlling for this, that and the other, we would have lost readers. We've just come back actually from Mexico, and I now start to think of razor wire as a symbol of inequality. So, you know, people withdraw from community life, whether you look at those measures of trust, or whether you look at Putnam's work, Bowling Alone, or his study of the Italian regions in his Making Democracy work. He's not really interested in inequality, but if you look at footnotes and so on, you can see high correlations between his measures of social cohesion, or social capital, and inequality. But basically, you get people withdrawing from community life, you get more defensive fences around people's houses, and you get more violence. It's a continuum, I think, as trust goes down. Imprisonment, 10 times as high in some countries as others. That's the proportion of the population, prisoners per 100,000. That's a log scale up the side, so at the bottom there, Japan is about 40 prisoners per 100,000. It goes up to 400, again a tenfold difference in the number of people who lock up. That is partly more crime, but it's mostly more punitive sentencing. And I think is another sign of something going wrong with the quality of social relations in more unequal societies. Whether it's more fear up and down the social hierarchy or less empathy, something leads to more punitive sentencing. And Kate also found that the age of criminal responsibility, when you start to hold children responsible for crimes, is lower in more unequal countries. So a harsher penal system in general. The next one is infant mortality. You can probably see this regression line should go through, doesn't go through the centre of all that scatter. It's being pulled down by Singapore. We've been accused of picking and choosing data by people on the right who really hate this stuff. You know, you show them that you can have a society where there's less mental illness, less crime, better health, better community life, and that we may be able to get there a bit closer by reducing income differences. Oh, horror! The idea that we could get a better society like that. And so, you know, everything they could do to rubbish our stuff and suggested we'd been picking and choosing countries, not aware that there are other studies that show these relationships using as many as 100 countries, some a few more, and how many things have been controlled for. But if we were going to pick and choose data, we'd have taken out Singapore. I never believed it. I gave some lectures in Singapore, and it turns out that one of there's several reasons, but one of the important reasons is, of course, that their city-state. They have about 25% of their workforce are migrant workers. They don't want their limited area to get even fuller. So they try and stop people getting Singaporean nationality, which you can get by birth or by marriage. So migrant workers get a health check every 6 months. And if they're married or pregnant, they get sent home. And so the people at the bottom of the occupational hierarchy are taken out of the picture of infant mortality. That's where you'd expect infant mortality to be highest. So I may say all our figures are just downloaded from the international sources, OECD or WHO or UN or whatever. We make no judgments of the data. If people don't like the data, they should complain to those organisations. Teenage birth rates, this is also a huge differential. You see the bottom left, births per 1,000 women in their teens goes from about 5 per 1,000 up. The UK has the highest in Europe. At 6 times that level, USA 10 times that level. I hope you've been noticing Ireland always just a bit to the right of the middle of this distribution. I should have been pointing that out. And also social mobility. The way people in these studies, and there have now been quite a number of them, measure social mobility is fathers to sons' incomes. So they're really asking, do rich fathers have rich sons and poor fathers poor sons? And it's not mothers and daughters' incomes, because there have been such huge increases in women's economic activity rates that it's much harder to look at it like that. But again, we just use the available figures. We show them just for that group of developed countries, but it's interesting that this relationship carries on even when you look at the much more unequal countries. I may say that people sometimes raise the issue, is it culture, not inequality? But think of that relationship I showed you with violence. If you think of the places in the world where you're in danger on the streets, where people get abducted for money, Mexico, where we were, South Africa, Moscow, huge inequalities, high rates of violence, and yet the cultural differences between some of those South American countries with high inequality and high violence, and South Africa and Russia, totally different. And if you look at the more equal countries, compare the Scandinavian countries with Japan. They've both got low inequality and low violence. Cultural differences could hardly be greater. So I think that inequality's effects override culture. I've been pointing out how big these differences are in performance, sometimes tenfold differences, sometimes, as in the infant mortality, only twofold differences, because that in itself suggests that this can't be explained just in terms of what inequality does to the poor. You can't get a problem 10 times as high because of what happens amongst the bottom 10% of the population. The assumptions are just too unlikely. But fortunately, we don't just have to infer that the differences are large because more of us are affected by inequality than just the poor. We can also infer, we can also look where you can compare people at each level in the social hierarchy between more and less equal countries. This is rather old data, where we were first getting interested in whether health inequalities are equally large in different countries. And so some Swedish researchers reclassified their infant deaths by the British occupational class classification. The high occupational classes, the professional occupations on the right, and the low unskilled manual on the left. Single mothers, I'm afraid anachronistically, this is by father's occupation, so single mothers are categorized on their own. But what you see is that this blue, the Swedish infant mortality rates, are lower right across society. The differences are biggest at the bottom end of society, but even at the top there seems to be a small advantage in being in a more equal society. And look, this is literacy scores of young people. They're not classified by the occupational class of their parents, they're classified by the years of education their parents have had. So still, you've got the children of well-educated parents, presumably more upper-class parents on the right, and on the left you've got the children of less educated parents nearer the bottom of society. And that graph shows that more equal Sweden does better than less equal Canada, and that better than less equal United States. The social gradient steepens. We show about 5 relationships of that kind in our book, and we've, since publication, I think that at least 5, maybe 10 more analyses have come out, other people's work showing a similar pattern. So I think if one's going to generalize about the effects of inequality, it doesn't just affect the poor, the effects are biggest lower down the social hierarchy, but we all do better in a more equal society. Note that this graph doesn't tell you whether the US has more badly educated parents. And this graph doesn't tell you whether there are more or less unskilled workers in Sweden or England and Wales. It says wherever you are, you do less well. So I'm going to hand over to Kate now. I think that's the blank slide that signals to me that that's what I should do.
He's going to come back, so you're going to have to tap him again. You're coming back at the end, aren't you, to do a bit more. So we're going to have to tap you twice. What I want to do this evening is talk to you about why it is we are inferring that this is a causal relationship we're looking at. Why we believe that income inequality causes health and social problems, and that we're not simply looking at a correlation between the two. And if I had had €1 for every time someone had said to me, correlation doesn't prove causation in the past 5 years, I would be someone who could redistribute income myself. It would be very, very nice. I've decided that the next time someone says that at a talk, I'm going to act really shocked and go, no, really? Oh my God, we didn't think of that. And see how they react. But, you know, Richard and I are epidemiologists, which is quite an odd discipline. You know, it thinks of itself as a science, and yet we can't do experiments. You know, we are an observational science. And that means we never get those little one definitive study that proves everything. We never get to see that black swan that means you can be absolutely sure that not all swans are white. It's not like that as a discipline. And instead, what it relies upon is looking at a large body of evidence, you know, looking at the literature as a whole and judging whether or not it's likely that you're looking at a causal relationship or not. So it's much more fluid, it's much more dependent on pulling together evidence from a wide range of sources. And as an example, you know, you could go out tomorrow and do a study of income inequality, for example, in British cities, and look at it in relation to self-rated health. And let's say you found nothing, or even a negative relationship. Would that disprove that there's an effect of income inequality on health? No, it wouldn't, not on its own. So, in epidemiology, we have a set of what we call causal criteria, although that might be a bit strong. It's really sort of key things we're looking for in the literature. And those include temporal sequence. Does the putative cause come before the effect? That's a really big one, that's really important. Strength of association, not so important, but you know, the stronger an effect, a supposed causal effect is, the less likely it is that it's being explained by something else. We look for consistency, you know, we find the same thing in different places, different times, for instance. Specificity is a rather old-fashioned one. It comes out in infectious disease epidemiology, where one microorganism should only cause one kind of problem. We live in a much more complex world, but it's occasionally useful. Dose response means we see more of a bad outcome when there's more of the bad cause. Cessation of exposure is the closest we get to sort of an experimental condition, sort of natural experiment. If we stopped being exposed to income inequality, you know, would our health get better? And similar to that is being able to sort of predict that when new data come along, that will fit with a particular pattern. And then we look at alternative explanations. Are there other things that could explain the relationship we're seeing? We like it if things are biologically plausible and if the whole picture looks coherent. But the big four there are the temporal sequence, the consistency, the alternative explanations, and the biological pathways. I'm going to leave biological plausibility and coherence to Richard at the end and concentrate on some of these others. And we've just finished a paper for the US National Institutes of Health, which is a causal review of the epidemiological evidence on income inequality and health using this framework. And they're going to publish that in the first quarter of next year. So it should be available fairly soon. Don't pay too much attention to what's on the screen. It's as much as sort of a note for me about what I want to talk about. The first is this idea that income inequality changes in income inequality must precede changes in health and social outcomes if it's a causal relationship, that we're not looking at reverse causality, for instance. And a group of colleagues from Harvard in 2009, just after our book came out, published a meta-analysis in the British Medical Journal, which was looking at a large number of what are called multi-level studies of income inequality in health. And this is where they control for every individual's income or education in the study, and then look to see if there's an effect of income inequality on health above and beyond that. And a large number of the studies that they included in this overall look were what we call cohort studies, where the income inequality is measured at the beginning of a time point, and then people are followed up over time to look at their mortality experience. So we can be sure that it's income inequality measured at the beginning of the period is not a consequence of poor health. As well, there's recently been a study of 21 countries looking at mortality over a 30-year period, so looking at changing income inequality and changing mortality. And they found a link for women of all ages and men of all ages except for the very oldest age group. And then there's a study by a man called Zhang, published in 2012, and he was interested to see what's the lag time between when income inequality changes and when health changes. Okay, so things like life expectancy are affected by what happens to us all the way from birth, and actually even earlier in the womb. And it's not clear when are the critical periods for affecting life expectancy or deaths from particular causes. And what Zhang found was that when income inequality changes, and he was using US data, you start to see an impact on mortality rates at about 3 years. And that effect continues to sort of accumulate for up to 12 years after the change in income inequality, and then those mortality rates have reached a new threshold. Okay? So it looks as if it's sort of a 3 to 12 year lag period for income inequality to affect mortality rates. And it's obviously, those lag times are going to be very different for all kinds of health and social outcomes we might look at. You might expect them to be very short for infant mortality, very long for other things. Now, most of the time, as Richard mentioned, life expectancy and health gets better in populations over time. And so, when income inequality gets worse, you're not going to expect to see declines in life expectancy, just that the improvements would slow down in those places relative to places that didn't become a lot more unequal. There is a study showing that in American states, in more equal states, life expectancy gains have not been as strong as those in more equal states over about a 30-year time period. But what this graph shows is what happens when there is a real shock to income inequality. And these are the countries of former Soviet Union, and at the side we're looking at changes in life expectancy at birth, and so if it's below 0, we're actually seeing a decline in life expectancy, and it's being related to changing inequality from 89 to 95. And those countries that became the most unequal, had the biggest increases in inequality, which are those on the right-hand side, actually saw dramatic declines in life expectancy as well. Some other work that's looked at things in a time sequence is the work of Wood and colleagues, who was at the time at University of Manchester, I think in Scotland now. And he used people followed over time to look at who developed problems of mental distress. And he found that if you looked at people's income rank, where their income put them in the ranking of the population, that predicted whether or not they developed mental distress over time, whereas their actual level of income didn't, as long as you were controlling for their income rank. And another study, I think, which is very illuminating, I'll just put the abstract up here to remind me to talk about it, is a study that looked at the health of migrants after they'd moved to the United States. And if they came from a country that was more unequal than the very unequal United States, then their health actually was more favourable than if they'd come from a more equal place than the United States and they came to an unequal country and stayed there over some time. We've also also recently published something looking at time series studies of income inequality and crime. So again, that's shown as income inequality changes, crime rates go up, and we could show that for property crimes and for homicides. And that's been published in a journal that's called either Criminology and Sociology or Sociology and Criminology. I can't remember. One of the two. And Richard showed you that income inequality is related to child well-being, and we found that in 2007 and then repeated that in 2013. We were also able to look at the change in income inequality over a 10-year period preceding the two different UNICEF reports on child well-being. And so we were able to look at change in income inequality in relation to change in child well-being, and found a significant relationship there. So countries that became more unequal over that time period, like Sweden, saw the biggest decline in child well-being compared to other countries. I'm not going to talk about the strength of the relationship between income inequality and health and social problems, because Richard's shown you numerous examples of those close correlations, and I'm not going to talk about Joe's response, because you can see that as well. If you get a little bit more equal, things seem to get a bit better. If you get a lot more unequal, things get a lot worse. So I'll move on to consistency. And Richard showed you this chart of trust. So, 3/4 of the population trusting one another in the more equal countries, and less than a fifth in the most unequal there. And what consistency means as a criteria for causality is that you see the same kind of thing in different places or at different times. And we repeated all of our analyses for the 50 US states. So as well as looking at rich countries, we look at the US states. And here's the same measure of trust. So in the most equal of the US states, again it's about 2/3 of the population who trust one another, and it drops to less than a third, or even less than a fifth in some of those most unequal states. So the scale of the differences in trust is remarkably similar in relation to income inequality in the 50 states as it is in the rich developed countries. But also, we've seen studies from Latin America that show that HIV rates are higher in more unequal Latin American countries, and various other measures of health like infant mortality as well. There have been studies comparing the provinces in Canada that show that the most unequal are those that have the worst health and social problems. And then the same kind of analyses for regions of Chile, regions of China, areas of Ecuador, states of Italy, areas of Japan, and areas within Russia as well. So wherever you look for these income inequality, health and social problem relationships, you find them as long as you're measuring income inequality at the appropriate scale, that is large cities or metropolitan areas, states, or nations. Income inequality within very small local areas doesn't matter, and you can pick that up in the discussion if you like. I mentioned that specificity is a bit of an old-fashioned criteria to do with whether one bacteria causes one infectious disease or not. But we've actually found it quite useful because we really believe that income inequality exacerbates problems that have social gradient. And here we're looking at different causes of death in American states and counties. We look at all-cause mortality for the working age population, different causes like murders, heart disease, respiratory disease, diabetes, etc., etc. And they're arranged from left to right. I'm not really good left and right, I'm going to check my notes. L is left. Left, the ones on the left, you don't get social gradient in those outcomes. So the ones on the left are breast cancer and prostate cancer. Those do not have the social gradient in health for most health outcomes or causes of death. Whereas murders and coronary heart disease have strong social gradients, so they're further over to the right. And these ones were arranged by how strong the effect of income inequality is on those causes of death. So at the top, it's a strong effect, a strong correlation, and at the bottom, it's much weaker. So you see the biggest effect of income inequality where you've got the steepest social gradients in outcome. So there does seem to be some specificity of the effect of income inequality there. And now we're going to have some animations. This is the only exciting bit in the whole thing, is whether or not it works, rather than what it shows. I mentioned that if you could stop countries being more or less equal, if you could change that, you could then wait and watch what happened. But we can't experiment with national economies that way, much as we might like to. But we can look at sort of natural experiments. And you'll have noticed that in almost all of the graphs and charts that Richard showed you, Japan is at one end, the most unequal with the better outcomes, and the USA is at the other end, the most unequal with the worse outcomes. And that is their current position in the world. If you'd actually been able to do these analyses about half a century ago, a bit more, just after the Second World War, you would have seen the opposite picture. Here comes the animation. That's it. It took me a long time to get to that. Just after the Second World War, America was a much more equal country than it is now. And it used to do much, much better in terms of population health and social issues relative to other countries. It was near the top of the league table instead of being near the bottom. And Japan was in the opposite position. It was very unequal compared to other countries, and it had very poor health. Now, when Richard was a student, and was mentioned in the introduction that he was a student at the LSE a long time ago, so long ago that he was actually able to attend lectures by Karl Popper and learn about scientific theory and theory testing, hypothesis development and all of that from the master. And has always reminded me of Popper's notion that a good theory or hypothesis will predict what later findings will show. Now, when we started looking at mental illness in relation to income inequality, we had comparable mental illness data for only a few countries, very, very few countries, and this was what we were able to show. And critics said, you can't put a line through that because it's, it's one bunch of countries and the USA, and it's all being driven by the position of the USA. But as more countries produced comparable data on the prevalence of mental illness in their different societies, we're able to look at more. And they fit very nicely, they fill in that gap. The same has been true for social mobility. When we first looked at social mobility, I think we only had, 8 countries there to look at. So Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark at the top, and the UK and the USA at the very, very bottom. Richard said how you need people, a lot of people in the labour force, to be able to follow them over a long time to be able to look at that. We can see more and more countries now, and again that gap is being filled in, so the robustness of the relationship is enhanced. And before I hand back to Richard, I'll end with alternative explanations. Just as I wish I had a euro for every time somebody mentioned correlation doesn't prove causation, I wish I had a euro for some of the really interesting things that people have suggested to explain the relationship we've seen. Because there have been some really weird and wild market ones, like eating fish, latitude, amount of sunlight, all sorts of things, weather. But the main ones that come up are whether or not it's actually simply an effect of your own individual income, education, socio-economic position. And the multi-level studies, the control for that show that that's not true. There is an effect, a contextual effect of living in a more or less equal society, whatever your income or education. Another big one has been what is being called in the field neo-material factors, which is a really horrible label, isn't it? What researchers who coined this term mean by neo-material is all the material things that improve health that are not just your income or your education, but things like public spending on health or the police force, or public spending on transportation, welfare systems, that sort of thing. But of the analyses we've seen where these have actually been tested as a competing explanation versus social cohesion, it appears that it is social cohesion and not mere material factors, public spending, that links income inequality to both homicides and to health. I won't talk about violence in different contexts, and so whether or not culture is the reason, because Richard stole my thunder on that. I didn't know you were going to show the barbed wire and the Mexican thing, talk about violence in those different countries. So I'll move on to ethnic heterogeneity. This is really my last point. And this one we hear much the most often when we're presenting in the United States. So talking about our work feels different in different countries. Okay, so if we're in Sweden, it feels really nice. Yeah? It's a bit like being in a warm bubble bath because everyone sits there and nods and feels great that they live in a wonderful country. And we've shown it, we've proven that they're doing really, really well. When you're doing this in the United States, it's quite uncomfortable for them, actually. I mean, really, it's funny, but it's not, because they do have strong sort of cultural values about being the land of opportunity, you know, and believing in their own freedom. Their knee-jerk reaction to this is that the problems, the health and social problems that are experienced in such depth in the United States are due to race. So it's because they have a large minority ethnic population, and that's why we see those problems. There are studies of ethnic heterogeneity in different countries and show that doesn't explain the income inequality and health relationship, and also doing the same in the United States. So there have been explicit tests of those. But also there have been studies of violence, of the murder rate, and studies of health, comparing, say, Canada and the US, or comparing the US and the UK, that look only at the white population and find these income inequality related effects if you confine your study just to the white population. So those findings can't be explained by anything that's going on in the black or Hispanic or other minority population. And I think another important argument is that the US has changed its inequality massively over time. It used to be a much, much more equal country. It used to do much, much better in terms of its population health. Its African American population hasn't changed that much. So how could they suddenly have become, the source of an enormous problem when they were not before? And the biggest change in the migration and ethnic makeup of the US population over the time that they have become much more unequal has been the in-migration of the Hispanic population from Central and Latin America. And actually their health and well-being is far better than you would predict given their socioeconomic position. It's known as the Hispanic paradox. So those explanations don't actually explain why we have a relationship between income inequality and other problems. Although, in a very unequal society, anything that attracts lack of respect, discrimination, being looked down upon, prejudice, whether it's race, gender, disability, language, religion, or culture, is going to become attached to poverty and deprivation and all of those other problems. So I'll leave Richard to finish up about the biological plausibility of all of this, why we're so sensitive to inequality, and show that the research coming from other fields is coherent with what we're seeing there. And I hope by the end, at least no one in this audience will want to tell me that the correlation doesn't mean causation.
Right, I think the first thing is to point out that income inequality is not something different from class and status. It's substantially about class and status. I think what we're talking about is whether we have a very steep social pyramid like that or a much shallower one like that. That if you like, the material differences between us creates the social distances, those feelings of superiority and inferiority, dominance and subordination. The shorthand for the causality that I'll go through in a bit more detail, if you like, is all the ways in which class and status imprint themselves on us throughout life are strengthened, intensified by greater inequality. So, you know, the fact that poorer kids do less well at school, have less good health, all these other problems associated with social status, those links become stronger, steeper social gradients. So, you know, if you want to create a classless society, you can't do so without reducing the inequalities between us, the material inequalities. If you think of Russia now, it has oligarchs and so on, no one can think that that is not going to be the new class structure of Russia. Once the kids have lived in mansions and been to wonderful schools and travelled the world, they are going to be seen as superior kids. Or if you think of the 19th century class system, which people thought was about breeding and so on, if you gambled your money away or drank your money away, you might be genteel poor for a generation. But after that, you'd just be poor. If you married up or made money, you'd be nouveau riche initially, but after you've got the sort of cultural markers of class and status, you'd be accepted. So I think we have to think of the material differences as the framework on which all the cultural markers of status attach themselves. So whether it's the schools who go to the part of town you live in, what clothes you wear, what music you listen to, what restaurants you go to, all those ways in which we express status, use money to express status, are part of this picture. So income inequality is not a new cause, it's telling us more about the way social hierarchy works. I often think there are two views of inequality. The most popular, the naive view, is that inequality only matters if it creates poverty or if income differences seem very unfair. But I think a more accurate view is that inequality brings out features of our evolved psychology to do with dominance and subordination, superiority and inferiority, which affect how we treat each other. Inequality increases status competition and status insecurity. It increases anxieties about self-worth and intensifies worries about how we're seen and judged, whether it's unattractive, interesting or boring and so on. So I'm going to try and convince you that this has something to do with our evolved sensitivity to hierarchy. That doesn't mean we're locked into it forever. If you like, our evolved psychology tells us what aspects of the environment are important in terms of what affects our behaviour. And basically we're saying that we are sensitive to the amount of inequality in our environment. We change our behaviour according to the amount of inequality. In the monkey hierarchy, dominance hierarchy, or many other animal species that have dominance hierarchies, it's a bullying hierarchy. The animals at the top, the dominants, are the strongest, and the ones at the bottom, the subordinates, tend to be the weakest. And the structure forms around which animals can see off which others. It is very much a matter of tests of strength. It's not quite as simple as that amongst some primates, but that's the basic, the most important thing. So I think you can see it as a bullying hierarchy. If you read people like Sapolsky or Carol Scheidele studying animals either in the wild or captivity, you see these patterns very clearly in their work. We don't have measures of bullying amongst adults that are internationally comparable, but we do amongst children. We showed a different set of data in our book on how much conflict there is between children in schools, which showed again more bullying in more unequal societies. There have been a couple more studies since then with more countries. This comes from Frank Elgar in Canada, who shows that the frequency of children who bullied others more than twice per month is much higher in more unequal countries. And it goes from, what, about 2 or 3% of them in the more equal countries than in the unequal countries. It's 10 times as high. Huge differences in the proportion of bullying. One of the really important studies when people were really trying to figure out what's going on behind health inequalities were the Whitehall studies of civil servants, classified by their position in the employment hierarchy in government offices in London. And they find that one of the things they looked at was a blood clotting factor called fibrinogen. It responds to stress, amongst other things, and here you can see levels of fibrinogen amongst men and women according to their position in the social hierarchy. 1 is the most senior in the Whitehall studies, 6 is the most junior employment grades in the offices. And you see that fibrinogen, both amongst men and women, is higher in in the lower grades. Of course, if you're a subordinate monkey, you have a lot more bite marks and scars on you. You have to keep out of the way of dominance, show conciliatory responses. I suspect that something like that is going on as a response to the stress of subordination, rather as if they feared that the senior civil servants were going to bite them. The error bars are larger for women because there are fewer particularly senior women for reasons that are only too familiar. Another indication, I think, that these patterns we've been showing you may have very deep evolutionary roots comes from a study in the Proceedings of the Royal Society quite recently. They took a picture of a young man and then computer enhanced the sort of masculine features, stronger jawline and so on. And they showed the two pictures to women in different societies and asked them which to find more attractive. And the women in more unequal societies found the more masculine face more attractive. You know, the dominant animals, the stronger ones, are the preferred mates in animal dominance hierarchies. So I think that we have to think about these, our sensitivity to social hierarchy. And of course, one of the things that people have shown a number of times is that, and the reason why violence is more common, now shown in 50 or 60 papers in more unequal societies, is because violence is triggered by people feeling looked down on, disrespected, humiliated. The loss of face is one way I can make you respect me, if no other way. In health, one of the big changes in our understanding of the drivers of population health that's come through research around the world over the last 20, 25 years is the importance of psychosocial factors working through the biology of chronic stress affecting the immune system, cardiovascular system and many other processes, basically down-regulating all sorts of biological functions that may be important for health maintenance but aren't important in a brief emergency while you're escaping from a dominant or a lion or whatever. The main groups of these psychosocial risk factors seem to be things to do with social status differentiation. Society is doing worse with more inequality, but particularly low social status being an important risk factor for health. Weak social connections, not having good social networks, involvement in community networks, relationships, the quality of your relationship with your partner, and stress in early life. I think these are all telling us about one common underlying source of stress, if you like, the insecurities that go with low social status. Anxieties, feeling not being valued, are rather like the insecurities, anxieties, feeling you're not valued that go with low social status. So maybe those two things fit together a bit. Then friendship fits into that pattern, because if you have friends, if people call you up and see if you'd like to come out tonight and sit next to you and include you in things, then you get rewarding, positive feedback. But if people choose not to sit next to you, you feel excluded, people avoid you, we all know how quickly those worries about maybe I'm unattractive, boring, socially gauche, people think I'm stupid, whatever it is, these self-doubts come crowding in. I think now we've lost community in our societies as we move around so much, constantly meeting new people. These issues to do with how we're seen and judged matter very much, but they are exacerbated in more unequal societies, where some people are worth so much and others seem worth so little. There's now data that shows we judge each other more by status. When choosing partners, financial circumstances is given a higher priority, for instance. I developed that kind of explanation of these risk factors when we came across this meta-analysis of 208 studies in which volunteers have been invited to come into the psychological laboratory, given stressful things to do while having their stress hormones level monitored. So trying to see, if we give you something stressful to do, what happens to your stress hormones? And in these different experiments all around the world, we're given different tasks. So it might be nasty bits of arithmetic. You might have to read your marks at the end and be slightly embarrassed if you've done badly. You might be asked to speak to the rest of the group, a bit of public speaking. You might be asked to write about an unpleasant experience you've had, or to put your hands in very cold water, endless different stresses. In this study, reviewing all that, they asked what are the stresses which most reliably push up levels of cortisol, the central stress hormone. And they say it's tasks that include social evaluative threat. In the paper they say threats to self-esteem and social status, where others can negatively judge your performance. Now, I think those are, when we talk about modern life as stressful, that's probably what we're talking about, whether we recognize it or not. Of course it's more stressful to lose your job or to lose your house, but that happens to rather few of us. These stresses I'm talking about, everyone here will know about them. So I think that is those issues to do with being respected and valued, looked up to or looked down on. You can see immediately how that fits in with social status and inequality. You can also see in a whole range of what are called stereotype threat experiments how sensitive we are to being seen as or thought to belong to an inferior group. This is a study from the World Bank. It's of children from different Indian castes. They were given pen and pencil tests to do. They did them in two conditions, one where they didn't know each other's caste, and then when they did know who were the high caste and who were the low caste children. When they don't know each other's caste, they do equally well. When they do, a big fall-off in the lower caste children's performance. That has now been replicated in all sorts of ways. It's been done by ethnicity in the States, by social class, even by gender. You're given tasks and you're given some little reminder that you belong to a group which is usually less good at this, usually a bit inferior, then it affects your performance. We have to think about children in primary schools and the differences, class differences in performance in relation to those sorts of studies. This is the abstract from a recent paper, the year before last, by Sherry Johnson. She is talking about a huge review, actually, of forms of mental illness and personality disorders related to the dominance behavioural system, a module in the brain which seems to be specialised in dealing with issues to do with status, dominance and subordination. And she reviews many different kinds of evidence that some of these mental conditions are to do with being seen as inferior, accepting inferiority, or struggling against inferiority, or assuming superiority, or struggling for superiority, all things to do with that trajectory. When she wrote this paper, she didn't realize that there was any evidence that these mental conditions she talks about are worse in more unequal countries. But that evidence has been coming out more recently. I'll show you some of it in a moment. But basically, the idea that bigger material differences make class and status more important and all their repercussions more powerful, I think is now shown in a number of different ways. That, as Richard Late and Christopher Whelan showed, that more status anxiety in more unequal societies. People buy more status goods in more unequal societies. I'll show you some of the evidence of this as I go along. People get more into debt because money is how you show what you're worth. People are less willing to help others. These are all summaries of studies. People judge each other more by status. They suffer more mental illness related to status insecurities, and they work longer hours. So, a whole range of things. This is Richard Laird's findings on levels of status anxiety across the income deciles. The richest on the right, the poorest on the left. The top dotted line is the more unequal societies. Yes, sorry, the key is labelled the opposite way around to the lines. More unequal societies have higher levels of status anxiety right across the board. Rather, as we showed, the problem of health inequalities goes right across the board. The effects of greater inequality seem to go right across the board, and more equal societies with lower levels of status anxiety. Two recent studies of conspicuous consumption. Someone showed recently that in more unequal areas of the USA, people are more likely, given whatever relative income they're on, to spend money on higher status cars. People using Google search data, which is now made available, it may be quite a useful search tool, as Google Correlate, for instance. They look to see what people in more unequal American states are more likely to search for, and what things they're more likely to search for in the more equal American states. In the more unequal states, they're more likely to search for fashion goods like Ralph Lauren clothes. And in the more equal states, they're more likely to search for things like chicken bake. They just want recipes for their friends or whatever. And the search terms classified blind by according to whether they're high or low status show that relationship. Here you see debt going up in the USA with rising inequality hand in hand because you're trying to keep up with others and you push up your spending. Same as working longer hours in more unequal states. This is not our work, it's someone else's, but people in more unequal countries work perhaps a month or two longer than in the more equal ones. Because, as I say, money is the indicator of your worth, and it becomes more important in more unequal societies. This is depression. If you're more worried about how you're seen and judged, some people go under. Social anxieties, status anxieties, depression, and so on. You withdraw from social life. You start finding social life an ordeal. And so community life weakens and so on. Levels of depression higher in more unequal states. This is narcissism. The opposite response, if you're worried about how you're seen and judged, some people would say, start going into a process of sort of self-advertisement. Instead of being modest about your achievements and abilities, you start flaunting them. And so narcissistic traits go up, as measured by the narcissistic personality inventory. This is Jean Twenge's work. Finally, In our book we say, on the basis of rather little evidence, that we think one of the costs of greater inequality is a reduction in modesty about your abilities and achievements. Since then, this study has come out looking at what they call self-enhancement. You could just as well call it self-advertisement or self-aggrandizement. Basically, they ask people in these different countries, how do you think you rate compared to the average in your country on various different criteria? Are you more generous? Are you more attractive? Are you clever? Or whatever. And in more unequal countries, people rate themselves above the average, that they call self-enhancement. That's quite a striking relationship. So that's the end of our story. We, as I said, were keen to show you the scientific evidence, and so we haven't talked about what we do about these problems of inequality or how it might relate to issues like climate change, which we both think are very important. But perhaps we can deal with those if you're interested in questions. Thank you.
Okay, so what we do is we take questions 1, 2, 3, and then I'll ask Richard and Kate to respond to them, and I'll just come out. So if you could each say your name, your affiliation, and then the question. Keep the questions as briefly as possible.
I'm Michael O'Toole. I lecture here on the determinants of health. I would like to thank you for your wonderful presentations and also for your very much used DVD, which I have benefited from over the years. And my question is, would the equitable tax system be able to mitigate the difference in equality the effect it would have on life expectancy? And has study been done on this? Thank you.
Well,
Another question?
Hello, my name is Jerry. I work with the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission. First of all, thanks for the presentation. It was really great. My question is this. Quite recently, the chair of the US Federal Reserve, the governor of the Bank of England, and the chief executive of Goldman Sachs have all made statements that income inequality is a concern and has effects on society. Do the authors think that this is due to the impact of their book, or is that wishful thinking? Thank you.
Maybe we take another one.
My name is Scott Kenny. I'm wondering, there's an organisation in Ireland called Claiming Our Future, which has been looking towards trying to argue for a maximum ratio in income. I'm wondering, does your data suggest where they should pitch that? Does it just say, we should go for a ratio of 1?
I'll answer the easiest one.
okay, you answer the easiest one of everything, that is.
There is undoubtedly a huge change in the number of world leaders who are talking about inequality as an important problem, and the frequency with which they do so, including the Pope, who says it's the root of all social evil, Ban Ki-moon, head of the United Nations, I think you mentioned the World Bank and the IMF, Barack Obama has called inequality the challenge of the century. Do we think it's the impact of our book? We'd like to think we've made a small contribution. But in many ways, the impact of our book was partially dependent on the fact that there was a global financial crisis, and people are looking for alternative models of how to view human progress and human well-being, what kind of economic models we need, how to do development in different terms. And so I think we like to think we've been part of that conversation, but there's certainly people working all over the world to reduce inequalities, and there are many, many people in our own fields doing really important and excellent research that just makes the picture stronger over time.
On the tax mitigation question, Michael's the first question. I'm sure that absolutely fundamental is dealing with tax havens, tax avoidance. Countries can't put up top tax rates while the rich can so easily sort their money away out of reach. I think that's why countries are so afraid of doing that. Fortunately, OECD has started to get agreement from many tax havens on sharing information on bank accounts with tax authorities in different countries, not only because they're worried about the loss of revenue to governments, but also because they are trying to keep tabs on where money is going because of the dangers of funding terrorism. So they have that double motive. I thought that maybe people would still be able to find new ways of hiding their money away, especially as these measures don't come into effect until 2017. But someone who is a great expert on these issues told me he thinks it really will be difficult to hide money away. So I think we will be able to get more redistributive tax systems after that. But I think a much more fundamental way of approaching greater equality is to reduce income differences before tax. And the main reason why our income inequalities have risen in so many countries is that the rich have run away from the rest of us. It's not because the poor have fallen further behind in most cases. If there's a paper I sometimes show data from looking at the 350 biggest American companies. And up to about 1980, the CEOs were getting 30 or 40 times what the average production worker got. By the first decade of this century, they're getting 200, 300 or 400 times as much. This problem is predominantly in the private sector, and as you know, particularly in the financial sector. If you look at the public sector, differentials are rarely more than 1 to 20 at the most, usually more like 1 to 15, 1 to 12 in local government. Even in hierarchical organisations like the police and army, it's not usually more than 1 to 20. I don't think we have to have a target because we've got so long to go. I mean, some of these countries are twice as unequal as others. One thing people often ask us is about how equal should we aim to go. And of course, in that graph we showed of our index, the one where they all line up so carefully, so accurately, including health and homicide and teenage births and trust and everything else, that is a linear relationship. It doesn't show any sign of flattening out when you get down to the more equal countries. We just don't know what happens when you get more equal than Scandinavians and Japan.
But I think the question was also about what ideal pay ratios should we argue for. And I think that I think people have a lot of common sense. So everybody in this room should think about the institution that you work or have worked in, and think about who's at the very top, the ultimate boss, and then think about you, and then maybe think of who might be the bottom of the pay hierarchy. And think about how much more salary or income you'd allow the top boss, compared to you, or you'd want the cleaners or the other staff compared to you. I would probably allow the vice chancellor of my university somewhat more than me. Okay? I don't want to do his job.
She's quite well paid.
I don't want to do his job, and he has more experience than me, he has more expertise, so I might say he could have twice what I have. Maybe 3 times what the cleaners have, And in other organisations, it would move around a bit. Sometimes we might say, 5 times in a very big organisation, really, really different jobs. But no one, when they all got together, would ever say 300 times, would they? I mean, it's just sort of off the scale of human comprehension. And that's why we need more employee representation on the company boards that set the remuneration of the top executives. Because sensible people would never do that. It's like turkeys voting for Christmas, isn't it? It just wouldn't happen. So any way that we increase economic democracy, get more democracy into the workplace, is going to reduce pay ratios to a more sensible level. I mean, maybe not perfect equality, and maybe we don't need that, but not this absolutely overblown, runaway excess at the top.
and this problem of excessively low pay and 0-hours contracts and insecure work at bottom.
Okay, let's do another round.
Thanks. My name is Veronica O'Keefe and I'm a psychiatrist. The question I wanted to ask was in relation to, one could argue that the most unequal societies and the biggest inequality is between genders, and particularly in societies, around the Muslim belt, if you like. And my question is, in societies like that where women have no income, where they are owned by their father and traded to a man whom they may never meet, who may be, be subjected to female genital mutilation, and where they're not allowed access to education, and where they have absolutely no status. I think the argument is absolutely, it's incredibly clear for the countries that you do it for, but I'm just wondering about the impact of, this complete inequality, which, as I said, I think is arguably the most extreme form of inequality in the world today.
Yes, hi, Mark Philby. I'm a lecturer in Health and Society at Dublin City University. I'd be interested in your points about climate change and the implications of your work for climate change.
Hello, my name is Santa. I'm a student at TCU, and my question is, we often hear about income inequality, but I suppose in terms of inequality, which stands from inequality of accumulated wealth, what is a viable and acceptable solution for redistribution of that sort of business income?
Just adding one more in on the other side. Yeah?
Thank you very much. Mary Flynn from the Food Safety Authority. I suppose when I thought of tax initially, and what I hear is it's kind of a fight. The employees have to make their way on towards. The bullied monkeys have to find a way of fighting back. And I'm just wondering, is there, change the paradigm and get society to buy in? Because when you mention the narcissism, all I think of is Facebook, and I hate it. I hate the self-promotion. And it worries me that young people who don't know better get sucked in into this competition. And I was just wondering if there's another way of, because there are some amazing people who are paid, who are very rich, who give money to charity, who travel the world, giving all their money away. And could we change, get society to buy in and make it a shameful thing, to scurry your money away? I was just wondering if there was a way of doing things a bit differently.
I think all of the forms of gender discrimination and inequality you talk about are extremely important. Whether they are the most extreme forms of inequality that we see in the world today, I think it would be very, very difficult to say. There are so many groups whose identity means that they are in the same position as women in those societies, without access to anything, let alone power and income. We have looked at women's status in more or less equal rich developed countries and in the 50 US states, and it's clearly linked to inequality. So women's status is higher where societies are more equal, and that's things like the proportion of women who go on to higher education or are in the legislature, or the gap between women's pay. Unfortunately, we don't have data for the kinds of countries you're talking about on the health outcomes that would allow us to really compare them one to another, or that we don't have data on their income inequality. But I'm sure that their health and their well-being will be severely compromised by the kinds of discrimination they're facing, the constraints on their activity. And in a way, income inequality is a form of social injustice, but of course it's not the only one. And they all tend to be tied together. And so where one is heightened, you tend to see more of the other. So in more unequal states, more hostility, for instance, and less agreeableness, lower women's status, more bullying. There was racial hostility in one study too. So I just think all of those things get exacerbated by greater inequality. And so the fight has to be on the causes. On philanthropy and greed and worrying about conflict, I do think we need sort of a new vocabulary to talk about the kind of economy we want. And that means words like cooperative, mutuals, sharing, reciprocity. We need to be thinking about an economy that works for the majority of us and not a tiny minority. And I think you're absolutely spot on in that somehow there needs to be a shift where to be seen to squirrel away as much money as you can for yourself or just your immediate family, or clawing your way up so you can accumulate massive amounts of income and wealth, does need to be seen as socially abnormal and socially obnoxious, and not a way in which you contribute to society or create the good society. And the reason I feel optimistic most days when I get up, not every day, most days when I get up, is because we've seen such huge social change over the past few decades. In terms of women's rights in many countries, in terms of civil rights, say, in America, gay rights throughout many countries. Huge progress over quite short periods of time. And that change always came about because of grassroots pressure and movement. It never came about because someone in power decided to give those rights or privileges or extra access or power to a minority group. It came about because groups started to demand that from a more grassroots perspective. And I hope that in maybe 5, 10, 20 years, 5 on a good day, 20 on a bad day, it will be as embarrassing to be seen to be greedy, as you're describing, as embarrassing as it is now to be seen to be a racist or a misogynist or a homophobe. So I do think we need that kind of shift.
On climate change, the obvious connections are that, as we summarise at the end, there's evidence that there's more consumerism in more unequal societies, and I think consumerism is probably one of the biggest obstacles to reining in carbon emissions. And if you're going to do that, because consumerism is driven substantially by status competition, we must reduce the inequality that intensifies status competition. We also see that in more equal societies, I think because community life is much stronger, there's a stronger sense of the common good, the greater good, if you like. And of course, if we're going to respond to climate change, and increasingly it looks as if we're leaving it too late, it means thinking about the greater good of humanity as never before. But there are also, there's evidence from, for instance, a survey of business leaders' opinions showing that in more equal countries, business leaders think these environmental agreements are more important. They give a higher rating to them. I think in more unequal societies, business leaders think it's not their job. Their job is to look after the businesses and welfare. It's more a sort of dog-eat-dog society, everyone for themselves, I think. We have put all these things together in a pamphlet for the Fabian Society that came out very recently. The pamphlet is just called A Convenient Truth. You can download it for free from the Fabian Society website. The Fabian Society is a think tank in London. Another thing I think is that corporations, large corporations, seem to be more and more the real obstacle to dealing with climate change. If you read Naomi Klein's new book, This Changes Everything, she really details the huge sums of money that the fossil fuel industries have poured into both rubbishing climate science and to subverting, making dependent on them many of the important green organizations, environmental groups, which many of them now receive large sums from the oil industry and so on. So, you know, I think that part of why we think democratization of the economy is, I see it as the next stage of human emancipation, to build not only companies with employee representatives on boards, hopefully a majority at some point, but also employee-owned companies, cooperatives. The evidence suggests they have many advantages. There are quite a number of valuations, including by people at the Harvard School of Business School, that show that productivity is quite reliably higher if you combine participative management with ownership measures. You get higher productivity. Now, accumulated wealth. I think you're probably referring to Piketty's work that shows that, in a way, because wealth is owned by such, it's so highly concentrated in a small number of hands, because the returns on wealth tend to grow faster than the rest of the economy, the share in the economy of wealth tends to increase. And I think, again, the response to that needs to be a form of redistribution of wealth. And of course, if we did manage to democratize the economy, move towards employee-owned companies and cooperatives, it not only reduces income differences. If you look at the Mondragon cooperatives in northern Spain, employing something like 80,000 people, average differentials are around 1 to 9, not 1 to 300. And it also redistributes property, wealth, in that now you no longer have external shareholders owning companies, and it redistributes unearned income. So I think it solves a number of those economic problems at once, as well as actually people say it turns a workplace into a community.
Okay, I know there are many more questions. Unfortunately, we have to end it here, but not without first of all saying that if you're interested, of course, please tune in tonight at 11 p.m. to Vincent Brown. Then the TCD-UCD Research and Publication Series is going to continue early in the new year. And last but not least, of course, a very, very big thank you for fascinating engagement. Thanks very much, Richard and Kate, and good night to everyone.
Thank you all for coming.